Hi, everybody, and welcome to this Twitter space of Biosafety Now. My name is Yana Lambrinidou. I am affiliate faculty in the Department of Science, Technology, and Society at Virginia Tech. I am also a longtime activist on lead and drinking water issues in the United States. We are delighted that you're here today and honored to have the opportunity to speak with Matt Ridley. Um, Before I introduce Matt, I'd like to say a few words about today's topic. We'll be talking about Biorisks, COVID-19, and the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists Pathogens Project Conference that took place 10 days ago in Geneva, Switzerland. For those who are not familiar with the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, this is a 70-plus-year-old nonprofit organization that was founded by former Manhattan Project scientists and which is best known for speaking out about the dangers of atomic weapons. Today, the Bulletin's mission is to equip the public, policymakers, and scientists with the information needed to reduce man-made threats to the existence of the human species, including threats such as climate change and new disruptive technologies. 7 months ago, the Bulletin launched the Pathogens Project, which is a year-long task force of scientists and public health leaders that is developing a framework for tomorrow's pathogen research. On April 19th and 20th, the Pathogens Project held a public meeting in Geneva that featured task force members, policy leaders, journalists, scientists, civic leaders, and others to discuss the current state of biorisks, to develop recommendations on risk management for high-risk pathogen research, and to generate public awareness. As a newcomer to the subject of high-risk pathogen research, I found the meeting incredibly enlightening. I appreciated that it featured speakers with different types of expertise and from different parts of the world. And I was especially heartened by the fact that the meeting was open to the public, both in person and online. Perhaps most importantly, I found it encouraging to hear that the Pathogens Project Task Force is planning to incorporate participant insights into the recommendations it will issue shortly. As a newcomer to the subject of high-risk pathogen research, I must also say that I observed a vacuum in the conversation as well, and I think that it was a critical vacuum and worth thinking about. I'm really referring to the voices of marginalized scientists, journalists, activists, and members of affected and concerned communities who have for 3 years now worked tirelessly to fill serious gaps in the official mantra about the origin of COVID-19, in the official discourse on the safety and usefulness of high-risk pathogen research, and in our understanding of systemic institutional dysfunctions that enable, if not reward, unethical scientific conduct while keeping us, members of the public who often fund this research, in the dark about the existential risks that it puts us in. Arguably, when it comes to the COVID origin question, powerful players in the science establishment and the mainstream press would have succeeded in disinforming us if people with far less power, in my opinion, had not stepped up to unearth buried realities and speak inconvenient truths. The last 3 years have shown us, palpably and powerfully, what the history of science, medicine, and social movements has shown for a long time now. That the public does possess critical thinking skills. It is not as gullible as it is often assumed, especially on matters that threaten its survival, and that the public is perfectly capable of amassing information with the necessary receipts that challenges and corrects officially sanctioned claims about what's real, safe, and good. In the middle of a devastating global pandemic, the public has exposed problems not only with the science behind the official mantra about the origin of COVID, but also with the unspeakable degree of institutional betrayal that we have experienced from the very institutions that we are conditioned to rely on for staying connected to the truth. These broader societal questions are, I believe, as central to our ability to manage high-risk pathogen research as questions about something as technical as furin cleavage sites. But if public representation is not robust enough, conversations by the expert class are vulnerable to descending into paternalistic assumptions about what the public does and does not understand and how ignorantly the public behaves. If anything, I hope that the origin story fiasco will inject much needed humility into the science establishment and the mainstream media, and will propel the Pathogens Project Task Force to reach out to key players in the search for the truth and in the fight for safe research in order to solicit their knowledge, insights, and recommendations. With this, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker for today, Matt Ridley. Matt is a science journalist and nonfiction book writer with training in evolutionary biology. He served as science editor for The Economist, and he founded the Mind and Matter column in the Wall Street Journal. His books include Genome, the autobiography of a species in 23 chapters, The Agile Gene, How Nature Turns on Nurture, and most recently, Viral, The Search for the Origin of COVID-19, which he co-authored with molecular biologist and member of the Pathogens Project Task Force, Alina Chan, in 2021. Matt sat in the UK House of Lords between 2013 and 2021 and served on the Science and Technology and the Artificial Intelligence Select Committees. He started his journey into the SARS-CoV-2 origins question, trusting the official assertion that the research-related hypothesis was implausible. But unlike, I think, many journalists, he quickly did a U-turn. Matt attended the Pathogens Project conference and, for me at least, stood out in that he made a point of highlighting perspectives that I think are routinely ignored, namely about the growing threat of enhanced potential pandemic pathogens research and about the painstaking and groundbreaking investigative work of non-mainstream media journalists and many others who stood up, some while putting their careers at risk, to fill the large hole created by mainstream media's coverage of the COVID-19 origins question. Matt, welcome. What an honor to speak with you. And thank you for giving us your time on this Saturday.
Jana, thank you very much indeed. And very interesting introduction that you've just given, a great deal of which I agree with. And I think it's a very important question.
Well, let's start off by asking you. I'd like to hear a little bit about your background, and could we start by, could you share with us a little bit about your entry into the SARS-CoV-2 origins question? When and how did it happen?
Well, when the pandemic began, I took the view that this was a significant and important event. As a person who was interested in these issues, who had a background in covering biotechnology and molecular biology, I thought it important to inform myself. A number of colleagues in the House of Lords in particular were coming up to me saying, how did this thing start? I hear it might have been a lab. I was saying, no, I don't think it was. I've talked to a couple of virologists and they say it's very unlikely. I feel a bit of a fool for taking that assumption on trust early on, because within a month or two, I was looking into the evidence much more closely and coming to the conclusion that you could not rule out the lab origin. And then over the following months, not only that you could not rule it out, but that it was really quite plausible. My initial research was around writing an article for the Wall Street Journal about the animal origin of the virus. The Bats Behind the Pandemic was the title. And in that article, I pretty well accepted what I was told by a number of virologists, that the one thing I didn't need to discuss was the idea that it came out of a lab. by May of 2020, when the Centers for Disease Control in Beijing announced that the market was unlikely to be the origin, and Alina Chan published her preprint saying that the virus was surprisingly well adapted in its early phase to the human genome, I began to question the assumptions that I'd been given.
So today we're going to focus on the Pathogens Project conference that you attended. And the aim of the Pathogens Project is to create the framework for future pathogens research. If I'm not mistaken, your focus so far has been on the origins question. And I was wondering if you see a connection between how the pandemic began and what pathogens research should look like in the future.
I do. I think this is a wake-up call for the world. It was certainly a wake-up call for me, in the sense that while I thought I knew quite a lot about what was happening in molecular biology and genomics, it was a bit of a surprise to me to find out just how much gain-of-function virology was going on, and how close to the edge of risk it was. So, you know, the work involving the creation of chimeric viruses, the addition of particular sequences to viruses, etc., all flew in the face of some of the reassurance I was giving people at the start, other lay people, where I was saying, look, Mother Nature's a way better genetic engineer than we're ever going to be. It would be difficult for us to improve on the infectivity of a virus or the lethality of a virus. Mother Nature's doing 1,000 experiments every day to try and do that. We can't beat that. And then, I read into the subject and found that no, that's not the case, and that an awful lot of experiments are now happening that are way further down the risk curve, if you like, than someone like me who was half informed knew. And that needs to be addressed, because even if this pandemic didn't start in a laboratory leak, it's very clear that it could have, that the kind of work going on in Wuhan easily could have resulted in the leak of a dangerous infectious virus, and that kind of work is happening in other labs around the world. And that puts 8 billion people at risk as a result of the experiments of a relatively small number of people. And those 8 billion people deserve to have a say in what experiments are done. Now, I come from the perspective of being very pro-biotech. I've been a lonely voice pro-genetically modified organisms in agriculture in the UK and Europe for many years. And I think biotech in medicine and agriculture has huge potential. So it's precisely because I don't want to throw that baby out with the bathwater that I think it's very important we learn where to draw the lines between safe research on non-pathogens, safe research on pathogens, and dangerous research on pathogens that we should try not to do.
Yeah, this is really interesting, and I have to say, I entered this with much less knowledge and background than you did, and I also feel completely overwhelmed with how extensive this industry is of virus hunting and virus researching. Um, in your book Viral, you and Alina Chan state that answering the origin question is important for preventing future disease outbreaks, not for assigning blame. And I was wondering, isn't accountability important too, though? Shouldn't we view it as one of many mechanisms that we actually need to help us prevent future pandemics?
Yes, of course. If an airliner crashes, um, people want to know whether or not there was a fault caused by the designer or the pilot or someone else. And the same is true if we have an accident that results in an epidemic. So if it's a possibility that the pandemic began in a lab, then we need to know what mistake was made, when, and where. But I think it's also important not to turn this into the sort of witch hunt that would make it difficult for people to collaborate and cooperate. One of the things that the airline industry did at some point was achieve a certain degree of transparency and sharing by not being too focused on the blame and more focused on the lessons learned. And I think that's quite an interesting parallel that we need to be thinking about in this way.
Yeah, this is very helpful. I'd like to move to the Pathogens Project conference. In the epilogue to Viral, you and Alina write, and here I'm going to quote: "The world shows little sign yet of either finally shutting down the wildlife trade or addressing the risks of the burgeoning pathogen research worldwide, let alone both. There is little progress, if any, of governments designing a better system to encourage whistleblowing or transparency in science, public health, and global pathogen surveillance. Rather, the reverse. Honest discussions among leaders and scientists appear to be happening increasingly on burner phones and in secure email channels. We can but hope, like Shakespeare's Lancelot in The Merchant of Venice, that at the length truth will out." Unquote. Against this backdrop, can you help us assess the significance of the Pathogens Project meeting in Geneva? Do you see it as a promising departure from the politics of complacency, secrecy, and disinformation that have dominated the SARS-CoV-2 origins question? If so, how? And if not, why not?
I think the project is a brave start, a good start, but it is only a start. And I think one of the disappointments of it is that a lot of the people who've been very vocal in opposing even the possibility of a lab leak don't seem to have been prepared to engage with this project so far. That I think should change. As we said in that passage that you read out, we don't seem to be learning lessons. I talk to senior scientists who say, look, it doesn't really matter whether it began in the market or the lab. We ought to be tightening up the wildlife trade and tightening up risky research. Um, and I say, yes, but I don't think we're doing either. I haven't seen any great attempt to really change the amount of wildlife sold in markets in China or the rest of Southeast Asia. And I haven't seen any really strong attempt to say, let's get together a big international conference where every country in the world agrees to sign up to a document about what limits are put on research into risky pathogens, in particular viruses. So, there is no great effort to learn the lessons either way. And that's partly because the question of the origin remains unknown. And that enables both sides of the argument to say, well, yes, but it's the other side that needs to learn the lesson. So I genuinely think that starting to respond to the pandemic's lessons hasn't properly begun.
This is quite a sobering position, and I haven't seen any evidence to the contrary, sadly. Um, what would you say was the biggest highlight for you, if there was any, from the Pathogens Project conference? And also, what about the biggest lowlight, if there was any, anything that left you concerned or pessimistic?
Uh, I think, obviously, it was great news that George Gao attended the conference from China, because he's been a central figure in China's attempt to understand the beginning of the conference. of the pandemic, and he, came with a very open and friendly approach to that meeting, and that's the beginning of a rebuilding of a conversation between China and the West that is extremely encouraging. On the other hand, he didn't divulge anything very new, but I think one or two of the things he said were quite helpful. A highlight for me was also Mark Lipsich's keynote speech towards the end, in which he set out very clearly a number of key points that I think have become confused in the public discourse. For example, the claim that you can't have vaccines developed without gain of function research of concern. And I'm afraid, and he nailed that. He said that is simply not true. And that, if you say things like, well, if you don't do this research in America, it'll just go to a different jurisdiction. He said, no, often it's the case that you can get 80 or 90% of the insights that you would get from one of those experiments from a different and much safer experiment within the same jurisdiction. And there's no evidence that you'll simply drive this into other jurisdictions. So I think those, for me, were really interesting from a professional scientist, insights into why it's perfectly reasonable to put limits on gain of function research of concern without hampering the development of vaccines, cures for cancer, and other things.
Yeah, I found Mark's closing remarks incredible. And I think I spent like a bunch of hours tweeting pretty much everything he said the other night. I have this
Yes.
massive Twitter thread just on his comments. Let's go for a second to the presentation by Dr. George Gao. Um, in your book, Viral, you report that Dr. Gao first learned about the outbreak from leaked postings on the internet. You also report that back in 2020, he announced that none of the animal samples from the Wuhan market had tested positive for SARS-CoV-2, and also that you write that during the writing of your book, he did not respond to your and Alina's questions. Um, in his talk, if I understood it correctly, Dr. Gao characterized the research-related hypothesis as a conspiracy story. And I believe that he said the same thing about intentional release speculations, but I'm not totally sure that I understood that. Both you and Dr. Gao have emphasized the importance of preventing future pandemics. So, with this objective in mind, can you share with us if there's anything about what Dr. Gao said that surprised you or that you found encouraging or troubling? And also, if you had the opportunity to ask any question, is there anything you would want to ask him?
Well, Alina and I did have several conversations with him and found them very helpful, but only made limited progress, I would say, in finding out what he really thinks happened. He's a very, as I say, open person and he's a good scientist with a great international pedigree in his career. What I think he was saying was, let's stick to the facts. Searching for the origin is still premature. I disagree with that. I don't think it is premature, but he insisted on saying that. Sticking to the facts, I agree with him, and I think he was trying very strongly to emphasize that point, and not too much speculation. And he linked that pretty closely to a fairly strongly worded critique of some of the speculations that have tried to imply from the West that he was wrong about ruling out the Huanan seafood market, and that raccoon dogs might have carried it there. A claim that we now know through Jesse Bloom's work really doesn't stand up at all. So I detected a frustration with those in the West who've been desperately trying to breathe life back into the idea that the pandemic began in the market. The other thing he said, he said in public and he said it in private, so I'm not giving away a secret here, is that he used the word rethink. And he used the word rethink several times. And he was trying to tell us that we need to rethink not just how this pandemic began, but how pandemics might begin or might have begun in general. And in particular, he was saying maybe we need to stop looking for a intermediate animal host. This thing probably came direct from bats to people. That's going a little further than what he said, but I think it's what he was implying. Now, when you take that step, when you say, right, it went directly from bats to people, that we don't need a raccoon dog, or rather, there's no evidence for the raccoon dog, the pangolin, or any other intermediate animal host, then you're left with the question of how it got from southwestern China to Wuhan in either a bat or a person or a scientific sample. And you have to admit that by far the strongest evidence we've got of viruses traveling from Yunnan to Wuhan is the bat hunting expeditions by the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And Dr. Gao did not say we can rule that out. He, as you say, he may have referred to it in passing as a conspiracy theory. He sort of has to do that, given that he lives and works in China. But for me, I think that possibility undoubtedly remains on the table, and that Dr. Gao's remarks have not ruled that out.
Yeah, that's very helpful. So in the opening panel about biorisks, there was an interesting exchange about the relative risk posed by different environments and conditions. People mentioned climate change and ticks, mosquitoes, human contact with wildlife, scientific research. And in the Q&A, you took issue with the panelists' suggestion that human contact with wildlife is in fact increasing and therefore poses a growing threat to humanity. You said that in fact what's increasing is pathogens research. Why did you raise this point, and do you think that a reliable rating, if you will, of biorisks is important?
Yeah, well, I felt quite strongly about this, and there was pushback from the panel to my point. I don't think they quite realized what I was trying to say. I wasn't saying that globalization and air travel have not increased the risk of a pandemic blowing up from a minor local outbreak. I think that undoubtedly is the case, and the pandemic showed that very clearly. So I think globalization and the chances of spreading something and the urbanization, etc., is an issue. But there was a very specific claim made from the panel by two speakers that human contact with wildlife is increasing. Everybody knows that. And I just don't think that's the case. If you think about the way people are moving into cities, they're much less in contact with wildlife. Even when they're in rural areas, they're relying on purchased food rather than hunted food much more, et cetera, et cetera. There's still plenty of contact going on, but not as much as there was before. And this was brought home to me, as I mentioned, by a conversation with an archaeologist who said, look, human beings loved going underground in the old days. In the Neolithic and Paleolithic times, they explored every cave they could find. They adored caves. They painted pictures in them. They took shelter in them. They did ritual things in them, etc. If they were going to come into contact with bats, they would come into contact 5,000, 10,000 years ago, just as much, maybe more, than they would today, when the only people going into caves are spelunkers, tourists, and scientists, really. Most of us don't spend much time in caves these days. Now, you can argue about whether it's getting worse or better, the contact between human beings and wildlife. But my point was, set that against what we know has happened in the last 20 or 30 years, which is a massive increase in funding for research based on going to bat caves and harvesting viruses therefrom with a view to cataloging them, understanding them, researching them, sequencing them, hybridizing them, and generally characterizing the risk they pose. The people going into caves these days include scientists. 40, 50 years ago, that wasn't anything like as much the case. And so I just wanted to get on record that the lazy assumption that there's somehow more contact between human beings and wildlife today, outside of science, is just not true, and it needs to be challenged.
And so, what did you make of the panelists' response? Because I agree with you. I also got the sense that that what you offered wasn't embraced that enthusiastically. And yet, I think that the point you made is also relevant to, the argument that of course SARS-CoV-2 is a zoonotic virus because look at the history of viral pandemics, and zoonosis is, there's a historical record of viruses coming from animals. And this argument seems to really leave out what you're saying, like the history of this exploded viral research that has gone on in the past, two or more decades. So what did you make of the panel's reaction?
Well, as I say, I don't feel they quite took my point on board, and I had some conversations afterwards with some members of them, and very fruitful and helpful conversations. So I'm not complaining about the response, but I think it goes to the heart of a key issue, which is that the default assumption has been that zoonosis is more likely. That the burden of proof is on the lab leak to prove that it is likely, and that the benefit of the doubt lies with the zoonosis theory. And I don't think that's justified. You hear people say previous pandemics always began with zoonoses. Well, actually, I think that's a slightly weird thing to say because pandemics don't happen very often. I mean, arguably, we haven't had one since 1918. Now, it depends what you mean by a pandemic, and a flu, a new flu strain that goes around the world is, I suppose, a pandemic. But the word is usually reserved for major disease outbreaks that kill great numbers of people. I think AIDS probably counts as a pandemic, but it's not as if there's a pandemic every few years. So that's the first point to make. And the second point is that, well, when you look at the last 20 years, you can say, well, yes, of course, outbreaks have mostly come from human contact with wildlife before that. But in the last 20 years, we've had a massive increase in scientific sampling of wild viruses. So the Bayesian assumption that the benefit of the doubt lies with zoonosis is no longer valid.
Right. So let me ask you about the conversation about biorisks. I noticed an interesting tension, and I don't know if you share my view. I felt that there was an interesting tension between the position that some countries or some sectors of society have adequate regulatory systems in place, and people who tend to, quote, stick to the law, unquote. So the risk lies in, and that was the implication, I think, that the risk lies in other places where there's inadequate regulation or where perhaps people tend to violate the law. And then there was another position that was a little bit different, that if I heard it correctly, that said that no matter where the research takes place, it is informed by a nonchalant professional culture. It includes scientists who are so eager to carry out their work that they tend to resort to shortcuts. And it also involves people with varying levels of training and competence. And that, in fact, some of the biggest accidents so far have occurred in some of the most well-funded and most technically advanced pathogens research facilities in the world. So I'm wondering if you noticed that tension too, and if you could speak to it.
Yes, I think you make a very good point. And Alison Young's book, Pandora's Gamble, which came out this week, has some extraordinary revelations about Fort Detrick and other highly sophisticated Western laboratories where accidents have happened frequently, where there has been a tendency to deny them and cover them up rather than be transparent about them, and so forth. And I think you also make a good point about the culture of science being such that pressing ahead with the next possible brilliant experiment that will get you a paper in a high impact journal is such an important incentive that it overwhelms the caution that might come. There was a very interesting point made by a number of speakers at the conference that the ethical constraints on scientific experiments have become very strict and very well adhered to and very carefully assessed in advance. In other words, doing an experiment that is ethically dubious has become very difficult in most universities, but doing an experiment that might risk a leak of a dangerous pathogen is hardly discussed. There are no similar committees that are there to discuss it as there are ethics committees, which is quite extraordinary when you think about it. And that relates to another point, which was very well made by, I think it was Tim Treven there at the meeting, which was that drawing up rules, drawing up legislation and regulation will only get you so far, because a lot is in the interpretation. And as we've seen with the gain of function moratorium, you can easily create loopholes and get around that. What you need is a culture of safety. And one of the points I would have made if I'd had a chance to speak in that part of the debate is that ostracism plays quite an important part in enforcing rules and regulations in science and in society, and that ostracism is often informal. That is to say, it's not. There isn't a rule that says if you do experiment X, you will be sent to jail. There is simply so-and-so has cloned a human being in China. We, the scientific journals, we, the Western scientists, we, the scientific academies, will say that's a disgrace. It shouldn't have happened. It shouldn't have been allowed. And the message will get back. And the institution that hosted this experiment will now fire the guy or prevent him doing future experiments because the institution wants to stay in the good books of the main scientific journals and other things. So there's a really powerful weapon there, which is to say, what you have done is gone beyond the pale. We can't punish you. You haven't broken a law, but we are not going to allow you to be part of the club anymore. And that, it feels to me, is a measure that is badly needed about the virus hunting and gain of function research of concern that has come to light as a result of the pandemic.
Yeah, and I think I think that we have a long ways to go, even though it's so important for us to get there, and I think it is possible for us to get there, and imperative that we do. But I think that the situation we're in now is that if you look at this whole concept, the mechanism of ostracism, that the people who are, socially ostracized right now seem to be the people who are fighting to speak truth to power on this issue. And so I think that this weapon that we have as a society right now, it seems to me, is targeting the wrong folks, whom we need and whose voices we need to reach a better and a safer place. I'd like.
I agree. I think that's a really important point. Actually, I'm towards the end of my career. I don't work for anybody. I don't have to worry about what people think about me. If I did that, I'd be in deep trouble. Um, and so I can say there is a very unfashionable view, which is that science probably caused this pandemic, and I'm going to champion that. But it's tough for someone to do that in either journalism or science, or particularly science journalism, who is still employed and relatively junior in their career, etc. There is a great push to ostracize you for talking like that. And this is what the whole business of labeling the lab leak a conspiracy theory did for months. And even when that dam broke in 2021, they repaired it and they put it back together. And by the middle of 2022, they were again making it very difficult for anyone to discuss this. So I completely agree with you that the weapon of ostracizing people from polite society for entertaining a rather radical and dangerous but highly plausible hypothesis is a pretty horrifying story of the last 3 years.
Matt, have you experienced attempts to ostracize you after writing the book with Alina?
Well, I've read some extraordinarily abusive stuff about me on social media and elsewhere. I've been blocked for by every attempt we made to contact Peter Daszak. I've been trying to get in touch with him for 3 years. All he ever does is send tweets about how my PhD wasn't very impressive. I don't know how he knows. I doubt he's read it. Things like that. This is yes. We aren't getting a fair hearing. There were a number of attempts to sort of rubbish our book before it even came out by people who hadn't read it and so on. It's bad enough for me, but imagine what it's like for Alina Chan, a brilliant young molecular biologist, aged about 30, at the start of a career, who has the courage, extraordinary courage, to come out and say, we need to take this hypothesis seriously. We want to show, not tell, where the evidence we think should take you. Leave the reader to make up their own mind. And here's the best we can do. And for that, she has been subject to some really terrific abuse and ostracism. And just to give you a very simple example, when the book came out, CNN agreed to interview us and then immediately cancelled the interview on the advice of their health editor, that we shouldn't be giving airtime to this kind of thing. That's quite interesting. And a lot of that happened.
Yeah, and so, not only does this, raise very disturbing questions when the people who are ostracized are people who have important information to share with the world. And also, I think that some of the weaponization is also turned against people who couldn't possibly pose the type of threat, if you will, in quotation marks, that you and Alina might be posing, and a lot of others who know a lot about this issue. I have personally been blocked by numerous of the market hypothesis proponents, and I am in this as a member of the public with no expertise on the subject at all, and who has never taken these individuals on or interacted with them. I am involved in this as a member of the public who's concerned about my child and my family and my community. And so when in a moment of a global pandemic and crisis with millions of people dying and even more becoming disabled, You have an expert class that should be bending over backwards to provide information to concerned members of the public. Instead, blocking people for trying to gather information and participate in the conversation, I think speaks volumes to how far away we've gone from ethical scientific conduct. And I think our society's expectations of what the role and responsibility of scientists is towards society.
Well, I think, Yanni, you make a very powerful point there, and you've been making it for some time. There is a view among many scientists that it's very irritating of the rest of us to have a view on the origin of COVID. It should be left to virologists who know what they're talking about. And they sometimes say that very explicitly. Well, I'm sorry, but we all participated in this pandemic. You know, it affected all of us. And the idea that there is some expert class who are above and beyond conversing with ordinary people about this is a very unattractive feature of the last few years. The clerisy, if you like, who, you know, a bit like medieval clergy who didn't believe that the Bible should be translated into English. It should remain in Latin so that people couldn't argue with them. That's not, it's not quite that bad, but there is an element of that in the recent conversation. And I think it's very important that people like you be allowed to champion the necessity of the public being allowed to express its view and to take part in the conversation. And as you say, be capable of learning the ropes, be capable of learning the basics of this. You know, they may not be able to get right up to speed on full molecular biology details, but the basic argument that the nearest relatives of this virus came from bats more than 1,000 miles away and were brought to Wuhan by scientists and were manipulated in such a way as to make them more infectious. Those are not difficult points for ordinary people to understand. So, yes, the priesthood approach of science is quite shocking to me in this story.
Yes, indeed. And I'd like to move on to the conversation at the Pathogens Project about science communication and science journalism. Uh, As we discussed in the beginning, you, like many science journalists, started with the assumption that COVID-19 was a zoonotic pandemic. And but within a few weeks, you were no longer so sure. And it seems to me that 3 years in now, many journalists covering the origins question have not exactly done the U-turn that you did back in 2020. And I'm wondering if you can share with us your assessment of mainstream media's coverage of the origins question. Should it raise any ethical concerns about the media's relationship to the public, especially in times of crisis?
Yes, I think it should. I think it's been quite shocking how the leading science journals like Science and Nature have covered this in a very closed-minded way, where they've set out to say, "Oh, the vast majority of scientists think it was zoonotic." Well, you don't know that for sure. You don't know that at all. There is no evidence that there's a poll suggesting that. Oh, it's a conspiracy theory to believe otherwise. Oh, the evidence for a lab leak is very flimsy. The evidence for a zoonosis is very strong. That's just not the case either. There's no very good direct evidence for either hypothesis, but there's a ton of circumstantial evidence pointing towards the possibility of a lab leak, and there's a surprising dearth of evidence pointing towards a market. So I think you know, Science and Nature have not covered themselves in glory here. I think the mainstream science reporters on mainstream media have been likewise very much inclined to dismiss and patronize and condescend those people who think a lab leak is possible, and to do so without investigating. What's been shocking to me has been the degree to which many science journalists are simply prepared to take on trust what they're told by so-called experts. And this is where Sarah Napton made a very good point at the Geneva meeting when she said, somebody said, um, what could scientists have expected journalists to do better? And she said, it's not our job to be your PR people. We aren't there to um, communicate as if we were your press office what you've discovered. We are there to challenge, but we generally don't do it enough. And there's a very striking pattern here. I've been a political reporter as well as a science reporter, and no way do political reporters take on trust what politicians tell them. They answer back. They investigate. They say, "Hang on, what you've just told me is a lie," or somebody else says that's wrong. The same in business. The same in sport. Sports reporters don't say the manager of the football club thinks they're doing a good job, therefore they are. He says they played very badly and his job's on the line, or whatever it might be. And it's been very striking to me since before the pandemic that this kind of challenge to your sources is not done in science journalism. You are there basically to relay the claims of scientists, not to challenge them. And for me, I think we need science critics, like art critics, like theatre critics, like book critics, people who say, I don't think that conclusion stacks up. I don't think your experiment is good enough. I don't think your experiment was safe. And I do so not as a scientist, but as a commentator, as a writer in a journal or a magazine or somebody on television, etc. And that profession doesn't exist. That science critic profession doesn't exist the way an art critic is, a sport critic, a business critic, a political critic. And I think that's an important missing element of this conversation.
Yeah, I think this is a very important point, and we discussed a little bit of it in a previous Twitter space with Michael Balter, who had also some really fantastic
Right.
insights into this problem. And I think that obviously this goes way beyond accurate reporting. I mean, it really places the mainstream media that shapes the understanding of reality for people literally all across the world. It places mainstream media in a position to turn science from a process of discovery to almost an empire that makes decisions on our behalf and has the power to make them real, to implement them. And I think that's an incredibly dangerous position to be in. And I really hope that something's going to happen to change mainstream media. Um, in the conversation about science journalism and the origin story, all three journalists who were on the panel mentioned the unusual paucity of information from people in key positions who probably know a lot of stuff and who normally would be expected to share their knowledge with the press, but who haven't done so. And I think it's clear that key individuals and institutions are withholding information. But then there seems to be another universe of people who also seem to know a lot of stuff and who are willing to speak to the press. And I'm talking about folks who have been ringing alarm bells about risky pathogens research for years, continue to be vocal about this threat, or people who have robust critiques of the officially sanctioned master narrative concerning the origins question, or people who are community members and have firsthand experience with troubling relationships between high security research labs in their neighborhoods and themselves and their neighbors. And so I'm wondering if you think that mainstream media has learned from this universe of people as much as it could or should have. Do you think that there's anything about these folks that makes them inappropriate as sources for journalism? And can you help us understand why a science journalist trying to get to the bottom of the origins question would avoid talking to these people.
Yeah, well, there was a little bit of a spat after the Geneva meeting between Natasha Loder and Richard E. Bright and Bryce Nichols about this question of being polite and so on, which I think gets into this issue. There are people out there with very strong feelings, like Richard E. Bright, that his concerns have been ignored for 10 years about the risk of gain of function research of concern, and there's been a tendency to see him as an extreme voice who doesn't get quoted in the mainstream media, and I think that's wrong. Now, maybe that's his fault for being a little bit too impolite on Twitter from time to time, but there's an awful lot of people who are an awful lot ruder on Twitter who do get quoted in the mainstream media, and Angela Rasmussen, for example. I don't think that's a fair criticism. But going slightly further in the direction you've just gone, there is this class of people, like I'd give you, for an example, Manali Rahalkar in India, who are not big name scientists. They're in obscure institutions, but they made extraordinarily important contributions to finding out key facts about the beginning of the pandemic. And as far as I can see, don't get much credit from the media and should. And then one step further, there are the people who are not even scientists, not even academics, not even in institutions, who've made enormous factual contributions. And this was the point I raised in the debate in Geneva, is that it's all very well those journalists sitting on the panel saying, we don't have enough facts to go on, and we're very frustrated with scientists for not talking to us more openly about these things. But what about the seeker? What about Francisco Ribera? What about Gilles Dameneuf? What about these people who've been digging up extraordinarily important information about what was going on in Wuhan in the lead up to the pandemic, who found theses from Kunming and from Wuhan that were highly relevant to the story, who, in the case of Francisco Ribera, created an enormous spreadsheet that enabled him to work out exactly which virus had been collected from exactly which site by exactly which team on exactly which date. These were really important facts. They weren't speculations, they weren't theories, let alone conspiracy theories. These were amateurs, but by Jove, they became expert in their particular corners of the work that they were doing. And this is citizen science, if you like. The reason these people became involved was because they had certain skills, and the pandemic really mattered. It was upsetting their lives and turning them upside down. And they jolly well dug in and did the investigative reporting that most reporters had failed to do, including myself. I feel a bit ashamed at how I was shown up by some of these people in terms of their ability to dig out information. I'm a little too old to be good at the internet, which is partly why we had a few technical problems getting on this evening. So others were better at it. So I think this is a really important lesson. Yes, for every, and Natasha Loder made this point back to me when I made this point, yes, but an awful lot of them are nutters. And it's true that there are people out there getting frantically excited about something they think they've dug up that is actually not important, and they are being a sort of flat earth maniac about. And you have to learn to distinguish between that and the really adept people who have actually found out important information and use them. And just because they don't have a big name and they don't have an address at an institution doesn't mean they can't be a good source.
Yeah, so maybe we can get a little bit deeper into this, because what I'm confused about is, although I appreciate any journalist who does not want to be quoting quote unquote nutters, I get that. I wouldn't want to be doing that either. At the same time, I think that some of the same journalists who seem to have that concern and are dedicated to putting out, good, solid information, seem to be the same journalists who are continuing to quote unquote and requote individuals within the scientific community who may have credentials and institutional backing and funding and all of these things, but who have a historic documented record of violating the most fundamental ethical principles of science development, knowledge making, and publication ethics. So I feel very confused about the criteria that many journalists seem to be using of purity and authority and validity, when what we're seeing is again and again, reporting sources as authoritative when the rest of us see that these are individuals who are not trustworthy at all. Do you have any thoughts on that?
You've expressed it so well that I'm not sure I can add anything to it. I think that it's a key point, and it goes to a sort of slight decay in journalism in recent years, where simply quoting the person with the institutional background that matters has become a substitute for digging into the story, partly because of the decay of the funding in journalism. Far less generous funding, and therefore people can't do the work themselves, and so it's easier just to quote whoever's institutionally elite. But the result has been that the good old-fashioned anti-elitism of the journalist has rather disappeared. And it used to be that you could rely on a journalist to challenge what the elite wanted you to hear. And now, particularly in science, I think you're seeing the opposite. You're seeing people say, don't worry your pretty little head with what you've read in my rival paper, because I've talked to Professor X and he says it's nonsense. Well, if that's, that explain why you think it's nonsense, not just the fact that Professor X said it's nonsense. That's not good enough for me. You've got to actually make an argument. And I think we've moved away from that. I do think that there's journalism has started to back up the conventional elite against the radical questioner, and that isn't its role.
Yeah. So as I ask you the next question that I have for you, I'd like to encourage folks to raise your hand if you have any questions, so that we can take your questions. And as you're thinking perhaps about your questions, I'm just going to continue going. But
Yana,
yes,
can you hear me? I just want to check my microphone. If you can
we
you hear
can
me
hear
now?
you.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Good. So then let me know when you want me to manage the questions. I'm gonna mute myself again.
Yeah, please do now. If people have questions, let's take those. And I'll continue by asking that. I have to say I was personally surprised to hear Natasha Loder, she's with The Economist, say how much she has enjoyed Peter Daszak's company over many years. And to my knowledge, Daszak is running an NGO that, according to various US government bodies, has committed multiple violations of the contractual terms and conditions of NIH grant funding. Plus, I believe that Daszak's professional history has raised serious questions for many of us about his honesty and ethics, and about the possibility that he may have played a central role, potentially, in the creation of the COVID pandemic. And I wanted to ask you, if a journalist has a longstanding, relationship, friendship with a character like Daszak, do you think it's fair for us to have concerns maybe about their ability to report a story with the type of depth and complexity and unrelenting determination to get to the truth that it demands? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think one has to be careful in what one says, because I personally don't think Peter Daszak's motives are all bad. I think he genuinely believes that in searching for viruses around the world and bringing them into labs for experiments, he might have been able to contribute to predicting and preventing future pandemics. I think it's a pity he's not prepared to admit that there was a risky downside to that. But if I were on communicating terms with Peter Daszak, and as I say, I have tried to contact him many, many times, and he has never, ever given me the opportunity, the privilege of a reply, whether I was doing so as the author of a book, sending him paragraphs saying, this is what we're going to say about you, please, would you comment on it? Whether I was writing an article for the Wall Street Journal and saying I would like your input into this, no reply on all occasions, but a certain amount of abuse on Twitter from him. But if I was on speaking terms with him, and he had been one of my sources in previous years, and I had spent time talking to him, I would be asking him, why on earth did you not tell us right at the start of the pandemic that in 2018 you submitted an application for $14.2 million to DARPA in the Pentagon to do work that included the insertion of a furin cleavage site, included the intention to insert furin cleavage sites into novel SARS-like bat coronaviruses. Don't you think it was relevant to tell us that work, that grant application existed? How come we had to find out when it was leaked to Drastic in September 2021, a year and a half into the pandemic? Peter, surely you recognize that was not the right thing to do. And I would rather hope that if I was on good terms with him, he would give me a straightforward answer to that question.
Shubhan Bora, I'm going to unmute you if you want to. We'll get back to Carl. Okay, he's getting added as a speaker. Let's see. Okay, there you go.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
yeah. Hello, hello, Matt. I'm a great fan of your work. I would just like to ask, adding restrictions or regulations to the research of pathogen, would it slow down the innovation or stifle the innovation in that field?
Very good question, Shubhan. And I don't believe it would. And I think Mark Lipsitch has made a strong argument that it wouldn't. That if you look at the development of vaccines, yes, they depend upon research in virology. Yes, they depend upon really quite sophisticated experiments. But no, they do not depend upon the kinds of experiments that enhance the pandemic potential of pathogens. It is possible, for example, to characterize the relationship between an antibody and a spike protein in a coronavirus without using live viruses. You can use a bacterial artificial chromosome with the spike protein in it, etc., or other examples. So I do believe very strongly that we need to be developing vaccines, and that we can do so without harvesting novel viruses and enhancing their pandemic potential in the lab. Now, where you draw the line is obviously crucial, and we mustn't draw it in the wrong place, but I believe it is possible to do so.
Gregor, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you so much. I found wide agreement with what Matt had to say. Three things or three concepts. The first one being manufacturing consent. Jana wondered what the mainstream journalists are doing. Well, they aren't really, or many of them aren't properly reporting or asking critical questions. They are manufacturing consent. Okay, sorry.
Gregor, do
So,
the question. Remember, I gotta just
okay,
do it.
okay. Then do you agree with my assessment that many of these players, such as Daszak, Fauci, and so on and so forth, have massive conflicts of interest, and that this is also why they turn into bad faith actors?
Well, hold on. So you want to ask a question about conflict of interest? I guess. Well, I guess if that's the question,
Yeah,
okay.
That was the question.
Yeah, I got that. That was a good question. Well, Peter Daszak orchestrated a letter to the Lancet in February 2020 in which he said, "I have no conflict of interest." That was a pretty extraordinary statement. Alina and I appeared on the House of Commons Select Committee in the UK alongside the editor of the Lancet some months later, and we challenged that and why it had taken 18 months for the Lancet to publish a statement that he did indeed have a very large conflict of interest. And the answer we got was from the editor of the Lancet was that, well, we went back to him immediately and said, "Are you sure you shouldn't be telling us you have a conflict of interest?" And he didn't agree, and it took us 18 months to agree. Well, that was pretty pathetic, I think. I think there have been some quite shocking instances in the last few years of people whose reputation and/or funding and career would be affected if they admitted the possibility of a laboratory leak, and they didn't make that clear in coming forward with extremely strongly opinionated opinions.
I'm going to now go. I want to go to Dave Barry first, and then I'm going to go to Knuckle. Okay.
Yep.
Wait, where did Knuckle go? Oh, he left. Oh, okay. Well, come back on if you can. But Dave, go ahead.
Sure. Hopefully, someone didn't already ask this. I had a brief technical glitch. Matt, do you have opinions on? So for whatever regulations we decide for how what kind of gain of function experiments should and shouldn't be allowed and so on, do you have opinions on the role of legislation versus regulatory bodies run by scientists versus, and then for legislation like national law versus international treaties and so on? Do you have opinions on the different roles that these different things have to play in that?
Yes, I do. And my main opinion is that it's very complicated and very difficult, which is not very helpful to you, I realize.
Fair.
But I have been struck. I mean, I'm something of a libertarian. I think government regulation can sometimes get in the way of innovation, can sometimes get in the way of justice and fairness, that we can over-regulate certain sectors of the economy. And yet I've been stunned by how much more extremely libertarian scientists are when they say, "How dare you suggest that there should be any extra regulation on us? We are perfectly capable of regulating ourselves." Well, that's not even the most extreme libertarian hold up in the woods in Montana goes that far on the whole. We all.
I was noticing that too. Like Rand Paul is the one talking about externalities now.
Exactly. It's a fair point. Yeah, exactly. But getting the balance right, the problem with legislation is that it takes a long time to get it agreed. It can be very clumsy. It can be very slow to change. It's not very flexible, and you often end up with sort of mismatches between what you thought was the problem and what turns out to be the problem. Sometimes it can even make the problem worse. Whereas sort of informal, collaboratively developed, flexible rules can be very important. And we address this problem all the time in other sectors, in various aspects of business, in consumer protection, for example. We say, look, here's a body that is going to regulate this industry and keep the price down and keep the quality of the products up. We're not going to specify in advance exactly what the rules are. It's going to it's going to use different instruments to incentivize people to do the right thing. And there's no reason you can't do that in biosafety, just as you do it in ethics in science. So I think there are more flexible ways than pure legislation, but more independent ways than pure self-regulation.
I'm gonna now go to Knuckle. Dave, I'm gonna leave you on the panel if you want to chime in at any point. Just
Sure.
Go ahead, Knuckle, unmute yourself.
Thank you, guys, and thank you, Matt. Man, so many questions, but early in 2020, there was a paper, obviously we all know, from Prod and al. In India that spoke to the, just the uniqueness of the gene inserts in this virus. Very quickly retracted. I've made an effort to look and see what those authors have done since, and it's been kind of crickets, not just from a citation, but also from just interactions in that community or in that particular topic. Were they early and wrong, or was that just the first of many buried stories on the genetic construct and origins of this pandemic? Thank you.
I think you're referring to the work that implied that there were HIV inserts in the virus. Is that right?
Yeah, GP120 was the unique insert that they specifically referenced on the trimer of the spike protein. They didn't go into PRRA, but early on they saw that glycoprotein 120 as a very unique construct, and it is.
Right.
Were they early in showing concern, or is that just very early on? Was that the first victim of this campaign to kind of suppress the uniqueness of this virus?
Well, I'm ashamed to say I can't remember enough detail about those papers to give you a clear answer. My impression is that it was unhelpful to raise very specific HIV-related concerns early. It enabled the defenders of the natural theory to paint any of this kind of stuff as a conspiracy theory pretty early on.
I think when we finally saw the unredacted emails after Proximal Origin came out,
Yes.
I think they had a bit of discussion about the HIV inserts, and because this was their emails among each other, this was them being honest to each other. I think, if I remember correctly, they genuinely didn't believe the HIV inserts thing, partly just because it was mostly because it was very short sequences of the kind that, at whatever p-value you'd expect to see this surprising amount on average anyway.
Lord Ridley, thank you very much for your time. Carl Hodson-Thomas here. Long-time reader, first-time caller, if I may say so. My main question has been that we've all been charged of being epistemic trespassers for our outside concerns. And yet, when it comes to biosafety, it doesn't seem to me to be a field that is strictly, a virological concern. And I'd love you to speak to, the different fields that ought to sort of inform best practices, and also love you to address the fact that for some reason they've tried to pull the wool over our eyes about the fact that it could indeed just be direct bat to human field research that started the pandemic, and that's a research related pathway, which ought to suggest that risks have been taken, as we observed in David Croman's book, where Alexei, one of the EcoHealth staff, would go sampling without wearing any PPE.
Yeah. No, well, we referenced that quote from David's book in our book because it is very striking that he actually said, as they crawled into a cave, shouldn't we be wearing PPE? And the reply, I think it was from Alexei Chimura, but I'm not sure, was well, I occasionally don't wear a seatbelt. But back to your point about epistemic trespassing. And I think you also referenced the point that Fauci has recently made, which is that yes, but if it was a scientist picked it up in the field, then that's not a research related, that's not a lab accident. Well, I'm sorry, but that's just beginning to be really ridiculous in terms of its ability, its tendency to redefine what a research-related event would be. The epistemic trespassing point, I was told at one point on some radio or television program, are you an epidemiologist? If not, why do you think you can comment on the origin of this virus? And, I said, hang on, epidemiologists don't study the origins of viruses. They study the spread of them. It's a different discipline. So I don't know why you think that it has to be an epidemiologist who studies this, or a virologist, or an evolutionary biologist, or a zoologist, or any of these fields. The attempt to credential, to ostracize people based on narrowly defined silo credentials is not a good way of going about these debates. Anyone can have an opinion, even if they're if they're a taxi driver, they might have a good opinion on this if they've read up, if they've gone into the detail, etc. I don't believe in excess credentialism.
I don't know how many more questions you want to take, if there are any
I think
others,
let's
but...
do one more, and I have two closing questions for Matt, and then we can wrap it up.
Okay, go ahead, PRTD. Please unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Ridley. So this is a question for you. In the wake of gain-of-function technology gaining prominence and most likely to be widely used in the near and far away future, what do you think are the risks of such technology falling in the hands of the wrong people? Like, how do we know that a regime like the Iranian regime or the North Korean regime is already not making biological weapons using this GOF technology? And how do we prevent that from happening?
This is exactly the point that most frightens me. If you are a bad actor, a rogue regime, North Korea or ISIS or whatever, and you are watching the last 3 years, you are thinking to yourself, I can do a heck of a lot more damage with a biological issue than I can with a nuclear weapon or something. Well, maybe not a nuclear weapon, but an ordinary explosive. I can bring the world economy to its knees. The virus, I find, has to be highly infectious, but it doesn't have to be highly virulent. And best of all, when the World Health Organization breezes into town to try and work out how it started, they're probably going to shrug their shoulders and say it came in on frozen food. Now, for me, that's a real worry. We've sent a message to bad actors that not only are we vulnerable, but we're not very good at investigating, and that worries me. And I don't feel that concern is being taken nearly seriously enough in the wake of the pandemic.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up comment. I could call this as a question as well. Dr. David Asher, I think that's his name, from the Hudson Institute. In any of his interviews, he has highlighted this huge risk, and nobody seems to be talking about it. We should be absolutely genuinely concerned about the origins, but we should also be equally concerned about this falling to the wrong hands. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you. Agreed.
Yeah, if I may follow up on that, wasn't there that paper or article that came out about how it would cost $200,000 to recreate horsepox in a lab?
Yes.
Which is the first cousin of smallpox.
Yep. No, that's discussed again in Alison Young's excellent new book, Pandora's Gamble. And she also makes the point that the virus reached Switzerland by email. What she means by that is that 2 weeks before a human case turned up in Switzerland, the sequence of the virus had been emailed to laboratories in Switzerland quite legitimately and quite safely, and had been used to synthesize and grow live virus to study in the lab. So if you are a bad actor in one part of the world, you could, in theory, spark an outbreak in another part of the world these days. I probably shouldn't even be discussing this in case it gives them the idea, but it's a real concern.
Yeah, it is a real concern indeed, and I would like to add to the exchange between you, Matt, and Carl about the issue of credentialism and domain expertise. I think that there's a bit of a delicious irony in the argument that domain experts have no place in this conversation, and that is that anybody who's aware of the history of science on very complex socio-technical issues understands that for every one of these issues, there are multiple types of relevant and important expertise that come both from within different fields of STEM, but also social sciences and knowledge outside of the academy. So what I have found kind of interesting and almost a little bit funny is that the argument that is being made by quote unquote domain experts in support of shutting everybody else up also reveals a pretty deep degree of lack of awareness and potentially even ignorance around how these complex matters are usually addressed and how many multiple types of expertise they require to be properly addressed. So that's just a side comment, and I'd like to close with just another two questions.
Jana, it's if I may carry on from that, it sort of refers back to Matt's earlier comments about the airline industry. They've been so rigorous with risk management as a field of its own discipline, if you will, that they invented some wonderful standards. And ISO 31000 is one of those standards, which refers to risk and refers to risk management as the effect of uncertainty on an objective. Now, that might seem a little bit of loose sort of parlance, if you will, but why does biosafety not have such strict and rigorous sort of manuals and oversight? This is a concern to me as a risk manager myself.
Carl, I agree with you generally. I think that the extraordinary success of the airline industry in getting accidents down to unbelievably low levels is a very important lesson that needs to be looked at in this field.
Matt, I'd like to go back to the panel on science communication and to say, you mentioned Sarah Napton before. In her closing remarks, and Sarah Napton is with the Daily Telegraph, she said that covering the origin story has led her to lose a lot of trust in science and scientists. And yet we're also in a historical moment when confessing distrust in science or scientists can easily get you labeled as anti-science, if not a whole lot worse, and really ostracize you, going back to that conversation. So against the backdrop of the origin story fiasco, what are your thoughts about the relationship now between science and society?
Well, I agree with Sarah. I've lost a lot of faith in science as a result of this episode. I lost some earlier as a result of covering climate change. I think climate change is real and happening, but I think there has been a tendency to insist on a consensus that is way too alarmist and not very sophisticated, and to try and ostracize people who challenge it, which I think is a mistake. And I think in general, this consensus seeking is antithetical to science as a philosophy. The whole point of science is not that scientists are pure, perfect human beings who somehow challenge their own theories and so avoid confirmation bias. They aren't like that. They're human beings like the rest of us, but they live in a decentralized, fragmented world of different universities where Professor A sets out to prove that Professor B is wrong. And that is absolutely fundamental to the nature of science, as people like Richard Feynman have often insisted in the past. And I think we're losing that by talking about the science and having one view as if it was revealed truth, told to us about, whether it's climate or the epidemiology of a pandemic or the origin of a pandemic. And so I think that's where we've got to rediscover the ability of science to challenge itself and to accept uncertainty and disagreement. And I think that's absolutely crucial. I haven't lost faith in science as a philosophy at all. I have lost faith in science as an institution.
Well, that's a really big statement, and I share it. I'm with you on that, and I'm deeply troubled by it. In my last question is this: in the book that you and Alina wrote, Viral, you talk about the 1975 Silomar Conference Center meeting in California, at which scientists agreed to, among many other things, avoid work on highly pathogenic organisms. You write, and here I'm going to quote again, for almost 50 years thereafter, biotechnology was indeed reassuringly safe. But it has long since abandoned the cautious limits set at Asilomar. As this book has documented, pathogenic viruses have indeed been the subject of frequent recombination or engineering experiments. As the pandemic ends, a new and improved Asilomar is vitally needed, unquote. I'm wondering if you think that we should see the Pathogens Project meeting and the recommendations that will come out of it as a new and improved Asilomar, or if there's really more that we need to be doing as concerned members of the public to try and protect humanity from utter destruction from this type of research.
Yeah, I was struck in Geneva by the whether or not this was a parallel with Asilomar. In lots of ways, it's not. I mean, what was striking about Asilomar was scientists themselves getting together and saying, look, if we don't regulate ourselves on this area, we will lose public trust. That was what was essentially behind Asilomar. And it was very successful. It did rebuild public trust in biotechnology, and it did so partly by setting limits. And I was rather shocked when I was helping Alina to research Viral by how by how far this stuff we were writing about in the book was from the limits that Asilomar had set. Now, I obviously don't think that you should ban all biotechnology on pathogenic organisms, but I do think that enhancing the infectivity of highly pathogenic viruses is a pretty daft thing to be doing. And I think it's well outside the philosophy of Asilomar, but it's also well outside what the ordinary person in the street thinks is happening. And I think in that sense, science has lost connection with the social license to operate that the public has given it, and needs to reconnect and fast with that. I would think that the Geneva meeting was the beginning of a conversation, not an Asilomar in itself. But I stand by what we said in the book, that is what we need, another agreement globally that we won't do X, and if somebody does X, we'll kick him out of the club.
Matt, thank you so much for this incredible session. I found the conversation incredibly enlightening, and I really appreciate your time and your wisdom on the subject. And thank you everybody else for joining us. The recording is going to be up hopefully right away on Twitter, but certainly at least in the next few days on the Biosafety Now website. Thank you all for coming, and have a good weekend.